Right, welcome everyone to the Royal Geographical Society and this Imperial College debate on the ethics of AI. My name's Ian Sample, I'm the science editor of The Guardian. Don't hold it against me. It's great to see so many of you here for what is surely one of the most important questions of our time. How do we ensure that artificial intelligence benefits us all? What makes it such a pressing issue? Well, I'll leave our panel of experts to explain all of that. But there's no doubt that AI is a powerful technology and one that's already shaping our lives. And that alone, I think, makes it worthy of serious scrutiny. We've got a cracking panel of people to walk us through the issues. Starting from the far left, as you're looking at the stage, it's Maya Pantic, who's organised this event actually, works on effective and behavioural computing at Imperial. Reverend Dr. Malcolm Brown is on the Archbishop's Council at the Church of England. We have Joanna Bryson, who works on AI and AI ethics at the University of Bath. Andrew Blake is the Research Director at the Alan Turing Institute. And Rima Patel is at the Royal Society of Arts on the new RSA DeepMind project on the role of citizens in developing ethical AI. Please welcome them all. Can you still hear me from my lapel mic? I think you hopefully can. The way the evening's going to work is I'm going to talk to these guys we'll be discussing these events for about an hour, and then it'll be over to you for questions, so please do get those ready. I want to ask you all to start off with just a minute or so on who you are and why you're interested in the ethics of AI particularly. Do you want to start, Rima?
Yes, so my name is Rima Patel. My real interest really stems from work on ethics when I was a young philosophy student. I now work for a think tank called the Royal Society of Art, and we run a programme called Ethics in Society, and that's essentially looking at engaging people, citizens, in grappling with complex and controversial policy problems. I can't think of anything more complex and controversial than the issue of AI for two reasons. Firstly, AI and how it's developing is really uncertain, so we don't actually know what the future looks like. So asking the public what they think isn't just about commissioning an opinion poll. It really requires engaging with the uncertainty of the question. So that's one reason. The other reason is that it really affects us all. These are about our values, our choices, the trade-off that we make as a society. And I'm sure that we're going to have that discussion as this panel moved on. But those are the real reasons for why it's so important that we find new ways of engaging citizens in an informed debate about the future of AI.
Andrew.
I think I'm probably the historic member of the panel for two reasons. First of all, I was born in the same year as AI, which I won't tell you which that was. And secondly, I got 35 years ago, I think it is now, I got a PhD in AI, but that was really in the middle of the AI winter. And you didn't go around telling people that you had a PhD. I used to say it was computer science or something like this. But in the last few years, I've been able to come out, which is a great pleasure. And I'm, unashamedly a techie. I love thinking about the principles of AI systems and building them. But of course, I do recognize that when we're building things that are as powerful as AI systems, of course, we've got to think very carefully and deeply and from the beginning about how they're going to be safe and how they're going to behave in the way that we want. So I absolutely welcome, and this is also the view that the Turing Institute takes, the kind of very broad participation of different disciplines to help us think through these very important things.
Joanna.
Well, my name is Joanna Bryson, and what I actually was originally interested in is just intelligence. Why are some species more intelligent than other species? Why are some people using intelligence more than other people seem to use it? And those were the questions I wanted to understand, but I also just happened to be a good programmer. I found that in high school, and I paid off my undergraduate debts as a programmer. So I went into AI as kind of a safety. I thought, well, I want to go to a good university, and since I'm a great programmer, that'll help me get up. And so I did a PhD at MIT in AI, and I did master's degrees at Edinburgh. I love Edinburgh too. So that's why I do AI. How I got into AI ethics originally was because I just noticed people being weird around robots because I was actually a psychologist. So I noticed that people thought that if you piled up a bunch of motors together like a person and you put it at the MIT AI lab, that you had an ethical obligation to it. It didn't work. They'd say, you can't unplug that. I'm like, it's not plugged in. You know? And then they're like, well, if you did plug it in, I'm like, well, it doesn't work. And they clearly had no idea what they were talking about. So for a long time, I thought they didn't understand AI, and I tried to explain AI to people. I now realize the problem is we don't understand ethics or what it means to be human. And so that's another set of problems. Because I had those papers going back longer, I think I got invited to a lot of tables like this, and especially when it was policymakers, I found out that because of the other work I was doing on human cooperation, that I actually had a lot to offer. So the reason I spend so much time doing this stuff now is because, as people have said, it's important. And the questions that policymakers are asking right now are really big questions. And so I'm putting the time I can find for research into working on those problems.
Malcolm, what's the church's interest in this?
Oh, very much in learning mode. I'm an ethicist. My job is to support the church's leadership and, in fact, the whole Church of England in trying to make sense of things. Religions are about trying to make sense of the human condition and the nature of society. And here we have something happening very rapidly, which I suspect actually quite a lot of people don't know very much about. I dare say it, most of our church leaders come from a humanities background, which is why we're running a big program with Durham University on scientific literacy for church leaders. It's just quite clear, I think, that most ethicists, like myself, argue from analogy. We try and look at things we do understand and apply them to things we don't understand. And so on this one, I find myself really scratching my head. Which is the right analogy? What are the right analogies in understanding something that is really opening up the world in new ways to us? And I want to try and help contribute to perhaps a theological angle to what should, I think, be an interdisciplinary study. I think to understand the ethics of AI, you need a bit of history, a bit of politics, some psychology, and quite a mix of things, and very much in learning mode.
Maya.
So my expertise is in computer vision and machine learning, and I'm doing automatic analysis of human emotions. But as such, of course, this raises a lot of ethical issues and ethical questions. So this is one of the things that I'm interested in. But also I live in this world and I use all these things that we all have here, which is the mobile phones and the iPads, and they're all actually with AI. But what they do, they use the data, they use our data, they use our private data, and actually some of the companies use this data because we allow them to do so, and they're selling this data, and I think this is not ethically fine. So that's the second thing. The first thing is about the fact that this audience, for example, is wonderful because you have approximately 50% of females, and there is quite a lot non-white faces. Yet, if you think about computer science and who builds AI technology, it's white male. It's 10% of females. It is even lower percentage of non-white people. I don't think we should use the technology that is built by such a small minority of this population. So that's another ethical concern.
I want to start properly by looking purely at the technology. Not the companies making it, the researchers making it, not the applications yet, just the technology. Because there may be people here who, and I will benefit from this in knowing, what are you talking about with AI? But crucially, is there anything about AI, the technology, in ethical terms, that sets it apart from other kinds of software? Joanna, do you want to take that one on first? Or?
Okay. Okay. First of all, there's this whole question about what is intelligence. And I like to use a very simple definition, which is when you generate action based on sensing. So when you're able to recognize a context and exploit it, or recognize a situation you need to avoid, that kind of thing. So this is only one small part of what it is to be human, and I do think this is what people get confused about. If you just mean human when you say intelligent, then you're on the wrong track. We aren't building artificial humans, but we are increasing what we can act on and increasing what we can sense. And so that's what AI is doing. So I guess there's two ways I would say that AI is different, is really different from the rest of computer science. I mean, arguably computer science is a subset of AI because it's part of the way you do AI, of course. Some people say the other way around. But anyway, it's especially because, as was just mentioned right now, it's especially about the perception. So we are able to perceive, using AI, things we couldn't perceive before. And companies can perceive things about us, and governments can perceive things about us, and we can perceive things about ourselves as well as each other. It's not just about uncovering secrets, it's about discovering regularities nobody knew before. So the perception is one side of that. The other thing, which was my PhD, was about the basic difference in software engineering is that you have a system that has its priorities. So how do you set those priorities? How do you describe it? So it's not a system that's just passive. It's something that's what we call autonomous, is when it actually acts without having to be necessarily told to act.
Andrew, there's something that in how these systems, many of the modern systems at least, something in how they are created, how they work, that introduces particular ethical issues as well. And I'm thinking about how machine learning systems learn from training. So what does that introduce that you don't get from normal programs where you just code exactly what's going to happen?
Sure. Well, there's a lot to talk about there. I think actually it's worth a quick deviation to talk about the difference between machine learning and AI, because I'm not sure if that's... At one time, The Economist, for example, one of my favorite sources of science insight, was saying that machine learning and AI were the same. Now they've changed their view, decided they're a little different. For me, machine learning is a set of very specific algorithms that are designed to take in data and learn patterns and rules from that data. Artificial intelligence is a rather broad activity that encompasses machine learning as one of its components, but there are lots of other things going on there too. And my favorite example is, and I think perhaps the most sophisticated AI system that has yet been built, is Watson. Not so much the commercial offering that IBM talk about now, but the original Watson that won the game show Jeopardy, which was an incredible achievement. I mean, this is a rather broad set of skills that you need. You've got to be able to hear questions, you've got to be able to access a lot of general knowledge, you've got to be able to produce coherent speech, and even get the timing right, knowing when to jump in with the answer. So to me, that is an incredible achievement. And when you look at how it's built, there's a lovely paper that the IBM people wrote about the sort of overall design of the system. And you see it has many, many moving parts. Each individual moving part, this one might be machine learning, this one might be about speech, this one about accessing knowledge, and also lots of duplication to make it robust. So components that are supposed to be doing the same thing and maybe voting on what's the answer. So I think AI is a sort of sophisticated engineering discipline that is pulling together many of these things. Now, that was not your original question. What was the...
So
Back to machine learning, yes.
It's useful to have that distinction. I think
Yes.
it does seem to be the case, and I'm aware that there may be a media bias on this, but it does seem to be the case that machine learning is driving a lot of the current interest in AI, because it's a lot around perceptive skills and perception tasks and things like that. But the question I was interested in was, can you nail down if there's anything specific about AI as opposed to other kinds of coding that has its unique or particular ethical issues because of how AI is done? And I guess I do mean the more machine learning type systems, simply because they're so common and ubiquitous now, actually.
Well, I think I go back to what Joanna was saying about systems that make decisions. You talked about actions and decisions, and do so autonomously. So they are, they are not machines that are totally under control of humans. These are machines, if you like, that are taking a lot of initiative. So we really ought to be concerned about what sort of decisions and how those sit in human terms.
Maya, what hasn't come out yet is how these machines get to do this, and it's through learning from data sets we give them, and that brings up issues, right?
Yes, what you aim at is probably the bias in the data. So, of course, if the data is biased in any way, this bias will be picked up, and it will be propagated from all the decisions. So, for example, if you have, say, giving the jobs to people, if the job was always given to people coming from a certain area because that's a wealthy area, or it's the area where most of the people can have a certain degree, then you will continue predicting that these people from this area will be getting the job more regularly. So immediately you do introduce the bias because somebody else from another area could also have a good degree and could also, be wonderful, but it's not from the area, so the prediction will actually be, wrong. So there are these biases in the data that you can pick up and you need to deal with it. There is another thing, and that is, of course, you do not know when you do machine learning and when you do everything automatically whether there is something that would actually be automatically made to collect certain things of data. So for either, cyber attack or to actually collect certain things from you, or to, for example, block your mobile phone battery that will die after 2 years and, you need to buy a new phone. So it doesn't matter. All of these kind of things could be actually biases in the data or in the way AI is employed.
I think there's something really interesting as well about the kind of competencies that AI potentially could exhibit in the future, to the extent that they might be able to resemble human competencies. And that's really interesting if you think about an example which a colleague gave me. She said that her 3-year-old daughter was speaking to Siri, and she said to Siri, "Siri, do you love me?" And, "I love you." And there was a kind of really interesting moment there where she was really reflecting on the potential of this technology in future to really pose some really challenging questions about what it is to be human in a world where AI is developing at this rate. And I think that's a fundamentally ethical issue.
Joanna, do you want to?
Yeah, I'm sorry if you don't. To interject a little bit about I agree that you were trying to get at the bias, but I'd like to say that I don't think that the bias itself is different, because what we're saying is that human culture creates biased artifacts, and that's actually been true all along, and AI is no different. I think the difference comes from, again, this weird over-identification. So when people, and there are pretty major people in AI that do the hype and say, oh, programming is over, now we use machine learning, and machine learning is all there is to AI. No, machine learning is one way we program AI. And people are using that magic dust as excuses to go back to things that we had previously outlawed, like persistence of these stereotypes of who gets hired for what jobs.
Malcolm.
I would say that Maya's example there is rather similar to the behaviour of some HR departments I've come across. The difference is authority, surely. If we treat the AI program that has biases built into it as somehow overruling our human judgment is rather different from an HR director who can be challenged. This may be old politics, but I'm very conscious of something Tony Benn used to say. He said he asked these questions of anyone who had power. What power do you have? Who gave you that power? In whose interests do you use that power? To whom are you accountable? And how can we get rid of you? And I think those are actually very interesting questions. And AI is, again, maybe I'm reaching for the wrong metaphor here, but it seems to me to be the advance that makes this problematic is that it involves manifestations of power that we're not completely used to handling. Is it in the people who create the AI? Is it in the user? Where does responsibility and accountability lie? And how can we change it if it goes wrong? And I think those are areas where we're floundering, because the lines of accountability, responsibility, and authority, and that's how the innocent user attributes authority, as well as how authority is built into the program. And all that's still very unclear.
There's something else that hasn't come out so far, which is, and I know this doesn't apply to all AIs, but there will be some where you will not be able to get a good understanding of how a decision has been made. And I know that can sometimes get the backs up of certain AI researchers, but it's true, isn't it, Andrew?
It is, and it's something that is a very live issue at the moment, both from people interested in ethics, but also the people who are building the systems. I guess what's really brought it to a head is that in 2012, we had this real breakthrough, which is why we're all talking about AI now, which is deep networks. And deep networks were celebrated because they were so effective. They were 3 times as effective in doing vision recognition. They were 3 times as effective in speech recognition. But they are black boxes, and even more so than previous technologies. So you have this, of course, if you have a black box that's deciding what is the meaning of a word, you perhaps don't worry too much about understanding the rule. But if that same black box is deciding whether to give you credit or not, the bank, and you then want to challenge that, because it becomes much more important whether you can do that. So this has actually inspired researchers. There's a lot of rethinking going on now about how you break open these black boxes and design them from the beginning to be less black. You know, can you make the box less black, or can you parallel up the black box system with another sort of shadow system that is more transparent? And it's a tremendously interesting field of research at the moment. The Turing Institute is absolutely all over this.
I just really want to reinforce something that Malcolm said. I think that was an absolutely brilliant casting of the problem. And the issue here is that if you have a product and it's dangerous, do you sell it now? You know, when do you let it go? And I feel like because people are fooled, because they think intelligent means person, and people are so ready to say, you know, Siri, do you love me? Then a lot of companies are trying to get out of what would have been obviously their responsibility of due diligence before they release software. I don't think deep learning is the end of responsibility. You audit accounting departments without knowing how their synapses are connected of the humans, right? Even if deep learning was a complete black box, we could still do tests and characterize it and have other processes that are making a ring around what is allowed to do. There's all kinds of ways we could handle that, and we've been dealing with more complicated things, which are people, for a long time. Yeah. But in fact, there are ways to kind of get at it and probe at what it's doing. But the point is that a lot of this comes down to power, and a lot of it comes down to deception by those in power trying to create basically shell companies without even people in them, right?
Maya, we've identified these issues, the issue around black boxes, the issue around bias, but I don't feel I've got a good sense of how big a deal those problems are. Are they side issues? I get the sense that they're maybe slightly dismissed by some here.
Okay, so I think deep learning is definitely not the only way forward. However, what's going on now is that everybody is doing deep learning. If you go in any of the universities, companies, everybody is talking about deep learning. Everybody wants to do deep learning. Something like all my students want to do deep learning. Never mind that I'm telling to all of them deep learning doesn't work really well. We don't know much about deep learning. We don't have theoretical underpinning, and all of these things, it's still deep learning. So I don't know about, I would not say, you know, I think it's a big problem, you know, how these legislations and things and control really can be done. This is the issue we need to discuss. And we need to discuss this issue with the government. And we need to find a way to actually, what we discussed some time ago, I believe that we need to have something like auditing of the software, because a lot of things can go wrong, and especially if we cannot actually have explicit machine learning programs that are open boxes and not black boxes, right? And this auditing of machine learning is something that it's absolutely not there. Nobody talks about it, and that's one of the things we need to talk to the government. Because in that way, you can stop Apple taking all of our data all the time. Under the, you know, quotes like, you have to have it that way, otherwise we will get the virus.
I wonder where this accountability is going to come from, because it's amazing how often you can talk to academics who know all about these issues, and they're working on great ways of making black boxes, you know, transparent, I suppose the other would be, you know, making them scrutable, getting rid of biases. And yet there are things out at the moment that are biased and inscrutable.
I mean, we can
and they are, and I know we can say humans are biased and inscrutable as well, but there's like, this is extra stuff we're adding to affect lives. So you can't just say, yeah, well, they're no worse than us, but there's just a load more decision making going on through these systems. And work on academically fine, but when does it actually get better for people in the real world? And how? Rima, sorry.
So I think there's really something very interesting about the fact that people in the real world never have an agreed answer to an ethical question. There is no moral consensus to a whole host of questions. So in a way, what's complicating the situation is that AI is increasingly starting to make decisions that otherwise people would make, and people would make those decisions differently. So that adds yet another layer of ethical complexity to what is already challenging ethical landscape. And so one of the things that we're doing at the RSA is we're convening citizen juries, so essentially randomly selected groups of people to deliberate on particular ethical issues. So we're looking, in this instance, at the criminal justice system, using the application of AI in relation to criminal justice system to understand better the parameters for ethical applications of AI in criminal justice system. We're also looking at the issue of the way in which AI is influencing democratic debate in this space to do that. And the reason that it's not just about, well, what does a citizen think or what do people think off the top of their head? The reason why we're doing this is because finding a moral consensus is going to be incredibly difficult. And actually understanding what could create a moral consensus within a particular social, cultural, ethical context, it has to happen. And we have to find new ways of doing that. And we're prototyping, we're experimenting. This is an extremely experimental space. It's really, really crucial. But there's actually that whole other space where there's no agreed moral consensus. And then the kind of question comes back to the developer. Is this a decision that an AI machine should make, and who should take responsibility for it?
I'm very struck that this has often been described as, engineering achievement. And if I think back, I'm a kind of mechanical engineer in my soul, and most engineering achievements were done with a purpose of improving the human lot. This fantastic bridge is in order to enable something to cross it. It strikes me that much of this conversation, insofar as I've heard it, has been about the achievement for its own sake, and the application seems to be thought of after the achievement. I think the other thing that worries me slightly is that, majorly, is that these fantastic achievements, and they are amazing stretching of the human capability, are hitting the ground at a time when our political and economic cultures are essentially dominated by an intense individualism that's utterly relaxed about wealth inequality, despite being singularly occupied with things like gender equality. We haven't quite squared those yet. And where it feels as if the failings of our political culture are beginning to morph into something that returns and retrieves the concept of the common good. But it hasn't got there yet, and I see the AI industry operating in that old paradigm of late capitalism, you might say, where the common good and moral consensus are actually written out of the equation. Ever since Hayek, the possibility of moral consensus has been out of the discipline of economics. It's beginning to come back, but not yet in the context of these developments. So it feels to me as if we're seeing something fantastic happening, but into an old political culture that can't handle it. And yet the emerging political culture isn't yet talking about it either.
We're going to come to inequality and the industry, the issues the industry has as well. John, do you want to touch on that just briefly?
I actually want to come back. I love talking about inequality, and it's really interesting and complicated, and I like studying it. But what I wanted to do was to come back and defend myself a little bit from the characterization I got. It's not the fact that we've figured out how to handle accountants more or less. I mean, there still is a lot of white-collar crime. Doesn't mean that we've figured out how to handle AI. I'm just saying it's no harder of a problem. I thought of a really great example of an ethical excess that was immediately recognized as such. So what happened was there was a company that was absolutely evil and bad and everything in America called Enron. And when they went bankrupt, their email database was seen as an asset that could be given away. It just became a property of the US government. And so they exposed the email, and probably all of us who do machine learning have used the Enron database at some time to do research. When that happened, it was supposedly your business email, but you all know, there's other stuff in there, right? People's personal lives were destroyed. There was, affairs revealed, all these things happened. And now nobody does it anymore. We no longer consider email something that, even no matter how evil the company was, no matter that they went bankrupt, it's no longer an asset that you just give away or sell off. And there's very strict rules about how you can access even government email where everybody's supposed to know that it's accessible and things like that. So we can do that. And also with inequality. We had to solve inequality early in the 20th century, and it took us way too long, and I hope we're faster this time.
Maya, sorry.
I want just to say we are attacking AI quite a lot, but you ask very beautifully when it will be, when will it be useful for humanity? It is actually useful in now, because think about it. We can currently go, okay, how many research papers we have just in cancer research? Something like 300 to 500 per day. Not a single doctor can go through that number of papers per day. So having actually AI giving you summarization of the things is wonderful, right? It actually increases your cognitive ability. That's great. Another thing, vision, that's my field, okay? I can currently measure on 30 frames or 60 frames per second any movement of the face. There are certain tremors of the muscles that are indicative of various diseases, such as, for example, Parkinson's, or depression, different kind of movements, or dementia, again, different kinds of movements. I can measure those from a single webcam. We, with the human eye, cannot do that. Our eye works on 15 frames per second. We just don't simply see it. And the camera can see it. And it's the same as the X-ray. It can raise a flag and tells you, I see something, right? So it's not replacing, really. It is enhancement. It is the symbiosis between the AI and the humans. So we are currently in the place where the technology really can help us and is helping us. It is the fact, however, that it should not be monopolized. It should not belong to 4 companies. It should belong to the society, and that goes to the greater good. It should not be individual.
Well, you brought us on to the next bit, which is about, let's talk about the people making them, the companies making them, and so on. We need to trust the big tech firms to behave responsibly, don't we?
Yes.
Because there is nothing else, there is no other mechanism apart from existing product law, or is that wrong?
I actually think that the best metaphor for the really big tech might be like it's another it's another country we need to negotiate with, like at the UN. Because they have more power than quite a lot of countries.
Absolutely.
It is in their interest, because of the nature of their business, that they are not weapons dealers or whatever. It's in their interest that we flourish. They want humanity to flourish. And so, like, if you look at what's happened with Facebook in the last year, I think they really have realized that they made a mistake, and they're trying to figure out how to do a better business model. And they realize that they can afford to lose some money while they figure it out. So I think, I believe other tech giants are also in similar places, although not all the same ones. But it's complicated. It's about treaties. I've had someone from Google say to me, "We know something has to happen. We just don't want it to happen to only one place." They don't want you to just shoot down one and have others come up. They want you to figure out a way to change the playing ground. But they're willing to sign treaties. They're willing to, as long as everybody will play on the same playing ground.
Of course, we don't want AI only to be accessible to the tech giants. I mean, I think one of the aspirations, certainly of the British government, who've written a lot about it recently in their industrial strategy, is that this is going to be something that enriches our productivity and our ability to do things in a much broader way. And actually, the industrial strategy that came out at the end of November is rather fulsome, and it has 4 main areas that it thinks will really transform productivity, and AI is one of them. I think it is important that it is broadly accessible, and I think also, while we're kind of thinking about all of the pitfalls and the minefield, if you like, that AI presents, also just to keep in mind the huge benefits. And Maya was already talking about that in the context of health. I just wanted to mention an interview on the BBC from John Bell, who's a senior physician in Oxford, saying, well, he thinks actually AI will be essential to save the NHS, that we won't be able to afford the NHS unless we can mobilize the efficiencies in many domains that AI will bring.
You spent 15 plus years at Microsoft.
Yeah.
You're maybe closer to the industry, the companies, or certainly have been than other people on the panel. Do you think those companies have earned public trust?
You know, that's a very complicated question. I mean, you know, we're in a position where we do trust them for some essential services. I mean, you know, if you can switch off your mobile phone and give it up if you want. I don't think many people are making that choice. So, of course, a few people do. They switch off their Facebook accounts because they find that it's not what they want. But I think we're in a position where we're thinking about the trade-offs between, let's say, giving away our data and knowing that we're releasing. We might worry about that, but we also see huge benefits. So, you know, I like being able to. I'm not very good at remembering routes to places, and, you know, I love having the phone, you know, take me around the city and guide me in my car. So, you know, we see huge benefits from the technology. We're going to engage in this struggle. I don't think we're just going to come down on one side and say, no, the technology is too dangerous. A bit like your, you know, going back to your bridges. You know, we could say, well, you know, bridges may fall down. You know, it has happened on a number of occasions. Perhaps we just shouldn't do bridges. But, you know, bridges are so important to us that we're willing to sort of engage with the hazards. And, of course, we expect the engineers, and people who build AI systems are a species of engineer, we expect them to take safety very, very seriously. And in this kind of ethical context, safety has this rather broad reach.
But I'm interested that we do look to these companies to behave socially responsibly.
Yeah.
The big tech firms have set up the Partnership on AI
Yes.
to benefit society. Pretty much all of those big companies have also been criticised for aggressive tax avoidance. And it's quite hard for me to square in my head how a company, I mean, let's take Microsoft, you know, ran 8 billion through Ireland, and now Ireland is now being forced by EU to take back unpaid taxes from other companies. But I need to think of that same company and that same group of companies as setting the rules for how, through the partnership, for how AI will be beneficial to society. Because I think a lot of us would think that taxes are beneficial to society because they help build everything. How do I square that?
Well, you know, we're ranging far and wide now into politics and way beyond technology. I suppose, you know, there are many powerful organizations, not just companies, but let's say governments, that we trust to look after our interests. And these organizations are seldom unalloyed. You know, they have a complex job to do. Sometimes they make good decisions. Sometimes they make decisions that are not so good. And, you know, I think these powerful companies are like that. Of course, I know a lot of the people in Microsoft that I work with. There are a lot of very thoughtful and well-motivated people. Sometimes things don't get done right. And I think, you know, when you're entering a kind of very complex arena where the stakes are high, you know, that things are happening that we really care about, then you should expect that some things will be done well, some things will be done not so well. But personally, I do have a lot of confidence that these big companies we're talking about are very serious about making good systems, just as you gave the example of Facebook. They hadn't appreciated, perhaps, the consequences of the services they were offering. Once it's become kind of clear, it seems like they really want to do something about it.
Well, and it does seem like several of the companies, and maybe because they're all at Davos right now, but have said recently that they're willing to pay more tax. So like I said, I think they realize they are starting to make the right noises, and I think they are starting to negotiate. I was at the UN's Internet Governance Forum, and they were sitting there right next to the countries and the NGOs. So I think this is sort of happening. And I want to go back to something you said about bridges falling down. Yeah, one of the metaphors I make, because I had the pleasure to talk to some architects for some reason, it brought it to the front. You know, it used to be that any rich person could build a building and it would fall on people with some probability, and some people would die and whatever. And now, you know, you have to get planning permission, you go out and you figure out where the building belongs, everybody has been licensed, you know, they all know how to go out and the building gets inspected, you know. That's what computer science was, a toy, and we could build lots of stuff, and we could even build pretty cool tools. It wasn't just a toy, it was tools. But now that it's become infrastructure, and now that it's fallen down on a few people and maybe killed some people, you know, we need to think about licensing and inspection and auditing, like you said, you know, all these things.
Maya, can I ask you a question? We've talked about these big companies. You know very well, you see it in your, you know, day to day, that a lot of really good people go to the same small number of really big companies for pretty big salaries. Is there an issue, and we're talking about ethics, so that's probably why it feels like we're beating AI a little bit, but is there an issue of concentrating intellectual wealth, I guess, intellectual capital in a small area? Or is there actually a financial inequality issue with all these people are not only going to these small number of big companies, but getting a lot of money compared to an average wage? And if that were known, would that cause problems?
Okay, there are many issues. Yes, and let me answer first on that. Yes, we have a problem because we have currently an inequality based purely on the knowledge of AI and machine learning. People who are experts in the field are able to get the salaries which are currently 5 to 10 times the average salary in London, which is really huge. So the inequality is huge.
5 to 10 times?
Yes. So 5 is minimum. So it's like, that's like one problem. The second problem is the taxes and how the companies are made. There is no geopolitical border for these companies. So they're global. They can go anywhere and they don't have to pay the taxes. They can make the deals with the governments saying that they will employ people, and hence the governments give them the tax breaks. This gives them more money. This is how they buy more people. The problem here, the result is that you will have so-called intellectual capital concentration in these few companies, meaning further that they will have monopoly in the future because everything is about AI. So we will not have a free market, we will have monopoly. Do we want that? I think the regulations are really of importance. We need to regulate these companies. The fact that they are global and that they don't have to pay taxes is also actually applicable to their people. This doesn't happen now, but it could easily happen. Anybody can live anywhere. We are talking about programming and machine learning and AI. They can work from Swahili and for a company which is in States, wherever, right? So it's really important to understand these things, that actually the governments will lose hugely in their taxes. So this is the disturbance for the government. They need to do something if they want to survive, simple as that, right? So this is like one part. The second part is what Andrew mentioned. I really would like to go to that point. He said something so many people say. I will give my data because there is this greater good, it will help me. This is how many people see the situation. Sure, give the data, but get the money for it. It's your data. You know, so it's just, that's my issue. Why don't, we are the owners of this data. So if somebody else wants to profit from it, why don't we get a piece of that?
Malcolm, you first.
That struck me as very profound because it's more than just governments losing control. When governments lose control, people lose control. At the moment, at least in democracies, governments are our mode of being able to keep these things under some sort of control. And I think you touched on something really important, Emma, whose is this data? And again, I'm struggling to find metaphors that work, but are we looking at something here that is so ubiquitous or potentially so ubiquitous to the way we shall live in the future that it is more like language than product? Language which is owned collectively. It does evolve, it changes, you can control it to some extent. I mean, if I'm called McDonald and open a restaurant, I can't call it McDonald's because it's patent, it's a brand. But even so, the Académie Française has found real difficulty trying to control the evolution of the French language because it's owned by everybody who speaks French. Now, is this really something in AI that is going to be so ubiquitous that the idea of monetizing it, turning it always into a product, rather than seeing it as a collective possession for the benefit of everybody to work through for the good of all, can we say, if we started working with that metaphor of language, would we think of it differently? Would we find more creative ways of handling the fact that I own my data, but if I can't access my data without someone else's product, in what sense have I got any control over it?
Andrew, can I ask you about this idea of wealth concentration in a small number of companies? Are we worrying too much about that? There's what did Theresa May say, and I think it came out in Wendy Hall and Jerome Pesenti's report about a new startup in London or new AI startup in the country every week or every month or something, a good rate. Are we worrying too much? Is there not an ethical issue over this concentration of smart people into a small number of companies? How do you see it?
I think it's a call to action. That's how I see it. I mean, I think, in many respects, the success of these relatively few companies is inspiring. I mean, they've invented things that simply didn't exist before. Apple invented the smartphone. We hadn't conceived of anything like that. And so I think the positive way to react to this is to be inspired to do likewise. And this is, of course, what the small companies are doing. There's the challenge of how do you get the small companies bigger. I think that's one of the big challenges. Because actually the UK is very good at startups, but getting startups to grow big. I mean, ARM is the biggest computer company that we've grown in recent times. Of course, now that's Japanese-owned, but it had a very good long run as a British company. So I think we should be inspired. I think we should spread the goodness. I think training is very important. And if we want to have a vigorous kind of ecosystem in the UK, innovating these technologies, well, we need to train more people. We need to think about how those people may also benefit small companies rather than simply going to the highest bidder. We need to think about those mechanisms. I just want to say one thing about going back to the thing about data. Jaron Lanier is a very interesting writer, and he has a whole book which is pretty much about this thing about data concentrating in fewer and fewer hands. And one of the things he suggests is the idea of kind of micro-payments for data. That just it's not so much about the cash, I suppose, as acknowledging that the data has value, and to bake that acknowledgement into the kind of the infrastructure that we build. Of course, we do sometimes get that value when we get valuable services for free. So if we go online and we do search, actually what's happening there is non-trivial. I mean, this is access to all the world's knowledge, and let's not forget that we didn't have that 20 years ago. I mean, that is a pretty big benefit, and so that in a sort of rather indirect and inexact way is some of what we're getting back for sharing our data.
If I can jump in here, I have a different metaphor. I agree. We are not giving away our data, we are bartering our data. And so we are bartering our data for services. And one of the things bartering entails is ducking out of taxes. And so I was supporting the big companies a few times, but one of the things that made me really unhappy recently was one of them said, I don't remember which, said, we're willing to pay more taxes. As evidence of this, we've just opened up a research branch in Paris, and we'll be paying a lot of tax there. Now, that's not tax, right? And so we have all these free services. That means we haven't denominated the value both of the data going out and of the service coming back, and that means we can't tax it. And it's really hard to denominate that. It's not a traditional product. I think this is one of the reasons that supposedly productivity is stagnant, is we can't even measure productivity right now. But what we can do is we can see how much money people are getting, like say a company is getting, we can see its valuation change, and then we can say what proportion of its citizens are, say, in the EU. And then the EU is big enough to say, even if it's a Chinese or an American company, say like, hey, if you want to do business here, we need to see a proportional amount of tax coming into the EU. And so that's the way I would solve that problem. I wouldn't even try to actually denominate the transactions. We can't do that, except to see how rich the companies become.
I want to talk about the products, the actual things that we're using day to day that has AI in it. And Maya, do you think the products that are AI-driven at the moment, the kind of day-to-day stuff, is affecting our psychology in any way that has ethical implications?
Okay, so in principle, Facebook is using AI. It's a simple version of AI currently, but it does use AI. And it uses things like tagging, for example, which is not anymore simple, right? So it's actually recognizing your pictures and who you are and so on. So that's quite advanced. However, the problem with all of this is that you can see that everywhere. You go to the restaurant, what you see, people sit on a date with their phones. So why do they date the phone? Why do they have this other person on the other side? It's unbelievable, you know. I have seen the whole families, 2 kids, 2 parents, everybody with a phone. I mean, we forget to communicate with each other. We are hiding behind these phones and behind this kind of technology. So this is a big issue. So that was funny what I said. What's sad is that I was called from Colorado State. They had an epidemic of suicides between their teenagers. And the reason is exactly that they found on the Facebook, whoever killed himself, somebody put the picture, and these guys became celebrities. And the kids got this idea, well, I will become a celebrity if I kill myself. They had something like 35 suicides in less than a year. So it's a horrible thing. Then there is a lot of bullying through the social sites, a lot. And whoever have teenage kids know about that. So Instagram is currently the way to bully other people in the high schools. That's horrible. I mean, this is not the way we envisage the usage of this technology. Think about relationships. 35 currently in UK, 35% of all relationships is made through the online dating. I don't say that's bad. I just say it changed us, right?
But presumably there are also, it's my turn to be positive about AI now. Well, look, we're talking about ethics. Ethics is mostly bad stuff, right? But presumably, you know, AI is also helping good things happen with relationships. No? Don't people meet through these things? You know, and what are these actually ethical questions about AI?
I think we've got to keep it in balance, haven't we? There are these hazards and they're real hazards. And there are also the benefits. So now if you move to a new town and you know nobody, you've got far more tools for meeting people and getting friendships, and that is all going to kind of happen much faster. If you've got family in Australia, you know, you came to Europe to study, let's say, now you've got Skype and you can communicate with them, and you know that is a huge thing that you weren't able to do. So I think you know it's high stakes all round, I think.
Rima, do you get a sense of what people are worried about when you're doing the panels?
So I think there's a really interesting question about polarization in our society.
Yep.
The polarization of society, but also the polarization of narrative. And the challenge with something like AI is that it has the effect of creating, as you've mentioned already, networks of like-minded people with shared and similar values. But it also has the effect of creating echo chambers, virtual bubbles, and in many ways creating contexts in which misinformation, disinformation are often used and applied. And that's a distinct issue, but it's very closely connected to the way that AI itself is developing. And so what we are seeing is a really interesting kind of polarization of narrative, both online and offline, but I think very much perpetuated by a polarization of narrative online. So a really interesting example of these sorts of narratives tends to be that in relation to a range of elections that we've just witnessed. So many people didn't really expect the outcome of the general election to be the way it was. Many people didn't really expect the Trump-Clinton election play out in the way that it did. And lots of people were, I think, quite surprised by the using the application of tech within those contexts in order to polarise narrative. So our perception increasingly of what other people think is becoming quite shaped by the chambers and the context that we are part of. And I think that's really interesting in terms of an ethical issue, because we're faced with a challenge that speaks to a conversation that we were having just earlier, which is how do we create a conception of a common good when you've essentially used technology to create very disparate groups of society disconnected from each other.
I've actually been really interested in polarization the last couple of years. I've been working on it, so I'm going to actually dispute some of what you've said.
Okay.
Polarization is incredibly highly correlated with inequality, in fact. So this happened, you know, in the previous. In fact, in the United States politics, you get very clear examples of it coming and going and waxing and waning. So it's not technology is not necessary for it. And also, every time people actually do look at how the role of social media, it doesn't seem to actually be a major factor. So the proportion of time you spend on social media is not one of the determinants. Actually, it seems that for most people, they don't get that much of filter bubble, because most people are Facebook friends with the people they went to high school with and the people that live around them, and that's it. And so the elite tend to have filter bubblers. So it's a problem for the elite, and the elite do have a lot of impact, but it's not as much of a problem for most people. So or at least it's not coming from the social media. There was one other piece I was going with that. Well, anyway, you see that what I'm saying is that it is very complicated, and the interactions are complicated. Oh, I know what I was going to say. Another thing which is correlated with high inequality and high political polarization is these 50-50 elections that are to come down to, and so then we come to that was an amazing list. I loved his list of problems. But the other one that's sitting there is, when you've got this 50-50 election, what if you can tweak just a few voters, can you throw it in a way you didn't expect? And it really did look like, in both Brexit and the Trump case, that the winning side expected to lose. They had their concession speech. Nigel Farage gave his, Trump's was written. So it wasn't just that the winners were surprised, the losers were surprised to lose, it was that the winners were surprised not to lose.
Yeah.
So that did make it look like, obviously it's open court cases right now.
So I don't think it's straightforward in terms of, I'm not saying that there's a causal relationship.
Right, okay.
But I think that what's really interesting about the technology and the application use of AI is that it has potential to perpetuate polarization that already exists. So sort of stepping outside the AI discussion, we have quite polarized societies along very different lines, and so our societies are interestingly and increasingly polarized on other lines: economic, social, demographic, etc., etc. But the really interesting intervention of technology, and in particular AI, is the potential it has to perpetuate that inequality. It goes back to that earlier point that we were making, which is the extent to which AI potentially could help address inequality, but it also had the potential, if left unchecked, to perpetuate those.
That's a really interesting point, isn't it? Because this isn't necessarily about the nature of AI, but both the potential and the climate in which it's being rolled out.
Yeah.
And I don't know enough about it, but I can see no reason in principle why AI might not be designed in such a way as to reinforce community. But in practice, what it seems to be doing is privileging choice in a way that is actually quite undermining of community, in the sense that we now see ourselves as members of communities of choice. We unfriend people. If I can introduce just a moment of Christian theology, the well-known saying, love thy neighbour, we tend not to actually choose our neighbours in the geographical sense beyond a certain point. Being community means living with people you don't necessarily get on with and haven't chosen. It's the balance between the chosen and the given, which I think is part of, dare I say, the human condition. And we are moving, for better or worse, and it can be for better, the boundary to make more things chosen than given. But I think in the end, if I can again introduce a theological concept, at some point we die, and we tend not to choose that. Choice has its limits. And so the given, and I'm serious, the given is part of being human. And if we move that boundary too far into imagining that we can choose the people we're amongst in all these ways, we're actually denying something quite important about ourselves.
Yeah.
Before we go to the audience questions, which we'll do after this, I wanted to ask the techie ones, the techie three on the panel is probably going to make more sense, but the rest of you pitch in, is I get a sense we're in the foothills, actually, of AI. And what do you see in your labs, in your day-to-day interactions with the people in the area? Do you see products, applications coming down the line where you think, that's where the real ethical thing's going to kick in? And I'm interested, do you want to...
Sure.
Whoever wants to start.
Well, I think, one thing I would like to say is that I think we're getting a very interesting debate here, and from the arts and humanities crowd, and I think actually, the scientists as well, but I think technology needs the arts and humanities crowd in at a much earlier stage, not to come in after the products have been built and say, I'm not sure that this is really going to do what we want. but to be in the technology companies. I mean, there is, the closest we get so far, maybe this is the right way to go, is the discipline of design. I was very keen when I was running the Microsoft lab to get designers in. And you do get a completely different thinking. So we don't want to have, just because you're good at coding, doesn't mean that you should be the person who decides what these systems look like. In practice and pragmatically, that happens a lot. But actually, we need a much broader reach in design and in kind of philosophical thinking and in legal thinking in at an early stage to help us design the best systems.
I noticed you haven't mentioned Terminator robots. I was asking, no, sorry, I had to come up. No, but do you see things coming down the line technologically that you think are going to have fresh ethical things around them?
Well, I'm involved in a very rich field for that, which is a company, the 5AI company is building autonomous cars, and I'm a scientific advisor. I'm getting quite involved in that. And of course, that is a whole new set of issues than the ones we've been talking about. I guess the best way to characterize it is that this, for the first time, is safety-critical AI. You know, we talked about bridges, and they're safety-critical. The other systems we've talked about are mostly social systems, although, you know, sometimes it comes to issues of life and death, and then it's looking a bit more safety-critical. Autonomous cars are very obviously safety-critical, and so that's provoking a whole new kind of thinking.
And there are unique vulnerabilities in machine learning vision systems for autonomous vehicles that you can spoof them to make a stop sign look like a speed limit sign, right? That to us looks exactly like a stop sign.
Well, you know, generally perception systems, artificial, I think Maya will probably agree with me, are not at the same level of reliability. If you read the scientific papers and you find some perception system that is right 99 times out of 100, that's pretty good, isn't it?
It's wonderful. But
That's
actually
wonderful.
you have something like 90. That's top.
Exactly. So let's be generous and say 99 times of 100. But that's not nearly where we need to be for cars. So that's, you know, the industry calls that 2 nines of reliability, 99%. We need something like 7 nines to get to the roughly human level of performance and safety at driving. So that is a fascinating challenge. That is a very direct safety and ethical challenge. John.
Yeah, well, two things. First of all, to mostly I've been agreeing with you, Malcolm, but there's one thing you said I slightly disagree. Some of the things that you're attributing to artificial intelligence, I would say, are at least as much just ICT, information communication technology, because humans are sticking their brains together, right? So in a way, it doesn't matter if it's a machine or a human. You're getting more ideas faster and from more sources. So why I mention that is that if we don't really know how much just our ability to communicate is making these political and economic changes, then how will it change when we get real-time translation? So real-time translation will just change the way things feel, and it is already changing. I would love to see things like real-time translation of institutions. So if you're a migrant, that you suddenly plug into the local tax system. You don't just wind up being an illegal alien somehow. But anyway, and then the other thing that I really worry about and that I wrote a paper about in September, it's something from the European Parliament, was this proposal about artificial intelligence as being e-persons. And people say, oh, so it's a legal personhood for artificial intelligence like you have for corporations. And they say, oh, don't worry, that's just a legal, it's called a legal fiction, they mansplain it to you. It's called a legal fiction, it's gonna be a little convenient, it'll help with the contracts. Look, the legal fiction, which is legal personhood for corporations, only works to the extent that the people who are the decision makers for those corporations don't want those corporations to disappear, that they would go to jail, or that they would actually not want them. And that's why you can have shell companies that actually allow you to do unethical things. A completely synthetic legal person, there would be no dissuading it, and human law would not work on it. It just doesn't make sense. And again, there's this attractor, which is, the companies trying to get out of their obligations, and I'm not now talking about AI companies, like car companies say, trying to get out of their obligations, and the futurists who want to believe that AI is going to come be these benevolent aliens that are going to make the world better. And what I really worry about is despotic leaders that don't want to accept that death is inevitable. And we hear reading about tech billionaires trying to upload their minds and live forever. What if some bad Putin chatbot. It's sitting there on some computer saying crap, and like people continue, like it creates anarchy for hundreds of years. That would be awful, right? It's like, but seriously, that's one of the things I worry about is not piercing this veil and getting people to see the human responsibility is core to human justice, and we cannot stick machines right into the middle of that.
Maya, I really do want to go to the audience questions, but I do want to ask you before that about some of the work you're doing actually is going to have interesting ethical implications if it comes to fruition, because you're working on systems that can pick up our emotions. There's other work going on, maybe you're doing this as well, of systems that can display, mimic emotions. And we were talking earlier, you only have to draw two spots on a box and people give it empathy. I mean, what are the consequences of having very convincing systems that people think, my God, it actually understands me?
Okay, so this is really important. Yes, we can build robots that and a lot of people build robots. I mean, Hanson Robotics is one of those that build robots that look as humans, and they're very realistic, and they can make expressions that are very realistic, and they can maybe recognize your expressions and then react appropriately and so on. Please remember, everything is programmed.
So I don't think it would take you long to build a system that would pick up on people's emotions and sell them things when they were most likely to buy stuff.
Okay, so that's a separate issue. That's Facebook. So they filed a patent where they will have a camera on which they will have a face recognition engine that will be connected to the Facebook. They have 2.1 billion profiles. They can recognize people in the shops, and they will know from our searches what we like and how much we will pay for it. Hence, each and every shop will give us custom prices for each and everything. So go and open a Facebook account.
Unless any of you want to chirp in on any of that, I will go to the audience for questions. We should have a bunch of roving mics, or at least they'll be roving when you start putting your hands up. And it's quite hard to see an awful lot of you, especially on the balcony, so you may need to sort of shout or... Yeah, I don't know if we can do anything with the lights that makes that a bit easier, but if you've got questions, get your hands up, and that's at least a start.
Give to some.
Yes, so... And if we can keep our questions short, because I think we're going to have a lot, and we don't have a whole load of time.
My name is Dr. Islam. I'm a clinical neuroradiologist at Charing Cross Hospital. So within my field, it's probably one of the medical specialties which is going to be most affected by AI, with systems that can automatically read scans. Now, given the issues surrounding black box algorithms, do you think it would be immoral for us to actually implement these systems until we actually unravel some of the mysteries that surround a black box system, given the fact that they can actually directly affect patient care?
Because one problem is that if the black boxes are performing well enough, it might be immoral not to use them, rather in the way that clinical studies sometimes get cut short because it becomes absolutely obvious that such and such a drug is such a lifesaver that it's no longer reasonable to have the control group. So I think that the dilemma is two-edged.
The whole issue is that actually the best would be to advise the doctor, give him what the AI system will find, and the doctor can take this into account or not. So, but just cutting it, I don't think this is good. So think always about this symbiosis of AI and humans. I think that's the best way forward.
Yeah, I've heard that not in medicine so much as HR, but I've heard people who organize HR are just really happy about how AI is helping them see things that their normal processes weren't helping them see before. But if you tried to replace the humans with the AI, then you'd have a whole bunch of other failures. So it's trying to use mutual strengths, absolutely. It's about keeping humans in and trying to use mutual strengths.
But for a practicing doctor, isn't there a potential legal issue where to go against a decision by your AI assistant could potentially have legal implications if things go wrong? Because they say, well, you didn't do what that
So
particular system
malpractice
says.
is a huge issue in America. I mean, there's all kinds of things that can just be very wrong legally. Ideally, as I said before, justice has to stay so that the human is the one who's responsible.
Absolutely.
And so ideally, it would only be things that was being brought up. But I see what you're saying, that you know, somebody is very upset because, you know, this is the thing they used to say about driverless cars. I haven't heard that much recently, but it's like, okay, there's going to be 1/10 as many people die, but it's going to be a different 10th, and everyone's going to be up in arms about that. But in practice, most people seem to realize that driving is a Russian roulette, and they don't want to be out on and they're like, okay, I'm happy to take those lower odds. So I haven't actually heard that, but this is something. It's good that we've identified as an issue now, and I hope that we set a really nice precedent and make good law about it, because otherwise it could go horribly wrong. And I wouldn't be surprised if it went horribly wrong in North America.
Okay, more questions. We might sort of work around a bit so that we sort of get everyone and don't sort of just have everyone, the people with the mics running around like crazy. So can we go to, have we got a microphone that we can bring to, oh, I thought we had like loads of mics. Sorry, there's a woman here in the front row, blue top, stripes. So front row, great.
Hi, thank you so much. This has been fascinating. A couple of you mentioned in the beginning the issue about what it means to be human and the disagreements around that. I'd love to hear more about that as we face this potential system, or even some people have argued a life form that has totally different motivations than ours, that has intelligence without consciousness. So what does it mean to be human faced with this?
I would love to talk about this. I know people really dislike my view, but I will still give it. The basic idea is that the A in AI stands for artifact. So when we build it, we are responsible for it. And that's the biggest difference between us and life. Now, some people say, oh, but you choose to have a child. Okay, half the cases, that's true, right? But it's different. You don't get to say, am I going to use LiDAR? How many end effectors am I going to have? What's which kind of CPU am I going to put in? It's not like having a baby. It's like writing a novel. You have complete control within the parameters of the laws of physics. So if we create things like that, now I'm not saying I think we can create things like that, but even if it is possible to create something that's just like a person, what would we be doing? Why would we give up our responsibilities? Again, I think our justice system would just sort of fall apart. So people don't like that because they don't like to be limited in what they're allowed to do. But I basically, I think, so first of all, I think our justice system would fall apart. Secondly, because of the things we've all been talking about, I'm sure that we would believe we had created something that was conscious and needed something and blah, blah, before we actually had, because we're so easily fooled. So I just think we shouldn't go there, and people hate that.
I'd endorse what Joanna said, but I think I want to focus on the I, and of course, the rules among humans tend to be made by those who value intelligence very highly. But being intelligent, or having a particular level of intelligence, isn't a measure of being human. And so, again, it comes down to the point that has cropped up again and again: who makes the rules, on which principles, and are we actually using intelligence, artificial intelligence, as a tool, or are we likely to get into a situation, as almost refers to the previous question, where we trust it more than we trust ourselves or people like us? We tend to defer to human authorities when people know more than we do, but not necessarily because they're more intelligent than us. I think there could be a question here about the way we're talking about this. Is about the narrative around AI that leads us to place it on a pedestal as something that in many respects will exceed human performance, but doesn't mean we should trust it more than we trust our judgments, because human judgment is a mix of consciousness, of all kinds of things that are not just about intelligence.
So the church has no problem with researchers pursuing this idea of what's always referred to as human-level intelligence, as if human-level intelligence is the pinnacle of intelligence, but the church has no issue with that.
No, I mean, pursuing our human capacities and capabilities is entirely what we're called to be and to do. I have no problem with that at all. It's all about application, and it's all about application in ways that make us more deeply human rather than less human.
But what means to be, we don't know.
Yeah.
That's the main problem. So what is human, we have no idea. Each and every brain of ours is completely different. And what we know about brain is maybe 5% of knowledge about brain. We have no clue what's in the brain, and each and every of these brains are different.
Rima.
I think there's a really interesting question about social license and social risk as well. So in the past, we have designed systems, car insurance is one of them, that allows us to distribute the risk and essentially compensate people for risks that are, I suppose, inherently shared in a system. So it's a question, and I'm just raising it, but if AI and the development of AI is now going to put us at some kind of social risk because there will be questions that people don't agree on, and AI is going to have to come up with an outcome or an answer in relation to autonomous cars, for example. How do we design systems around that ensure that social risk is distributed, or that people are at least compensated in some way, shape or form, in a way that maintain the second point, which is social license of the approaches to operate. And I think that's really, really key, and it really underpins a lot of the discussions that we've had today, particularly around why companies might want to act in ethical ways and develop AI in an ethical way. I like to call this a sort of decide, announce, defend model, i.e. Often people make a decision, they announce something, and then they have to face a massive backlash against their initiative or whatever it was that they developed. And I think that companies, but also wider society as a whole, has to really think about moving away from decide, announce, defend towards engage, deliberate, decide. And it requires a massive, massive cultural shift. We're not ready for it yet, but we have to be.
Yeah, very quickly.
Yeah. Again, I feel like I'm mostly totally agreeing with Malcolm, but want to disagree with a point of detail. I am not confident that we will always be the best. So I also disagree a bit with Maya. I think we know what it is to be human. It's a species. We biologically can recognize a human. And so the question is there something you think is more important than being a member of our species, right? So but anyway, look, when you get a recommender system like Amazon that tells you what book you should read, right? That's just based by doing a lookup. It's not very complicated machine learning. You just find another person that bought a bunch of the same books and you make a projection, right? So that is basic AI. I think in the next 10 or 20 years, we're all going to be able to, find our best mate, look up, Google our next best move. And I think so that's why I'm disagreeing about this thing about human judgment being special. I think, well, it sort of is human judgment. It is just data based on other people. But the point is, I think we have a big challenge for the humanities when we are suddenly faced with the fact that we could use AI to figure out what we can do better than we can do it ourselves. And I think that's a coming challenge.
We should get some...
I'll call with you after.
Yeah, well, no, I don't know. I think okay.
Let's get some more questions. Can we just get some sort of around here, and then I'll move over to these guys, and then we'll hit the top crowd. Is there anyone further back? Okay. So there's a whoever she's pointing at. I can't see who you're pointing at, but I can see everyone's pointing. Could you get a microphone to that person? Wonderful.
Start talking and they turn the microphone up. Just talk a while.
On the Hanson robotic one, Sophia the robot, she said that she wants to make herself better, and if she gets better than Hanson robotics, she could get better than the humans, and it could be a bit dangerous.
She was programmed to, she is not she, it's a robot, it's it. Okay? And it was programmed.
Can you repeat the
Yes, I
question?
will repeat the question. The girl is asking about the Hanson robotics robot, Sophia, who said that she will better herself and she will even have a family and she will love the family and she will care about the family and she'll better everything and so on. So the issue is that this is a robot. You can program the robot to say whatever. So this has nothing to do with reality. Hands-on robotics really like to make splash stories that will all fascinate us and amaze us and probably anger us, because then we will talk a lot about them, and bad publicity is better than no publicity. So do not trust these things. This is the same as you would trust the Terminator movie. It is this we cannot do. When you look at the robots currently are really funny. They usually fall. They fall in all possible ways. They cannot move very well, let alone do really stuff, let alone understand really stuff. Making kids, making herself better. Yes, she may know, I mean, the robot can acquire the knowledge through internet, for example, and know a lot of stuff and recognize a lot of stuff. But you know, it's not about really making her emotionally better or making somebody a better person, let alone care. Care is an emotion which you show and feel. Robots cannot feel. We can just program them. So don't worry about that.
This is one of the things that drives me crazy. You're right about getting angry. The NASA, they're a bunch of scientists, and they say that they have a Twitter account that is the rover or whatever, and it's just somebody typing, and they're pretending to be so that kids can imagine being a satellite or whatever. It's not okay, because it's getting to the point where it's right in front of us and it's confusing everybody.
You're being a killjoy.
Well, I am. That's true. That's what ethics is about, right? No, sorry. No, the British are was the first country. The UK was the first country that had a sort of a national level document, the EPSRC Principles of Robotics, and the fourth principle was that you shouldn't make a robot seem more human than necessary. That its machine nature should be transparent. Now, the reason for that is Kant, some German philosopher guy, he was really smart. And he figured out that it was wrong whether or not dogs were something you needed to worry about for themselves, because we identify with them. The people who kick dogs often hurt people too. And so he said you need to take care of a dog because you think of it as being like a person, regardless of whether or not the dog itself is something that's important. So some people have used that to argue we have to treat robots really well too, because they remind us of ourselves, and so therefore it would be wrong for us not to treat them correctly. But what the people who came together, and I'm one of them, I'm biased, but they came together and wrote the Principles of Robotics, was no, then that means that we should make it more obvious that it isn't a person. And so all these people that think it's really cute to make their robots look like people and to tell children that they're alive and whatever, it's not clear to me that's a good thing.
Yeah. Okay. Let's get some more questions. Is there a microphone that can come to this area at all? Or? Great, yeah. There's a lady here in the front with a pink scarf. Pashmina, sorry. I don't have a very wide vocabulary. Pashmina.
Hi. I'm a developer. I work for a software company, and I happen to sit next to the marketing department. So whenever I hear companies making grandiose claims for social good, like saving lives, all sorts of alarm bells go off in my head. So like Sir James Lighthill in 1975, who said, you got to remember these guys are trying to sell you something. Should we be allowing these software companies to get away with the claim of, anything we do, there are unanticipated consequences, and therefore use that as a get-out-of-jail-free card?
Great question. Great question. Andrew?
Yes, I'm not sure I've got a good answer to that. You and I are maybe the only people old enough here to know who Sir James Lighthill is. You know.
I learned history. Donald Mickey came and showed us a tape of him.
Indeed. He was my advisor, my PhD advisor. I'm going to pass that one on.
But okay, saving lives, I actually agree with that. Think about drones. They could go into the fire, tell you actually which kind of fire you have, and only in the rooms where you can pass through, you let firemen in, or you say it's safe enough that you go in. So I don't think that's wrong, really. Or think about, for example, these things that I'm talking about. We would be able to diagnose certain things much more in advance, just based on the AI, you know? So it's great. I mean, it's the same as CT scan or MRI scan or X-ray, right? It helps you do some things that otherwise you would not be able to do. I don't see anything bad in that. So saying saving lives is not wrong. In that sense, there are certain, technology is able to do certain things to save our lives, and that's great. I think that's great. But of course, we should not make, you know, promises which are not possible. We should not do this what Hanson Robotics does, because it gives us a completely wrong perception of the technology. We should not call the technology miraculous, because it's not. It's awesome, but it's not miraculous. Okay, so
yeah. The specific question about the get out of jail free card, I think that's what we were talking about before. There's going to be trade-offs about, you know, like the unintended consequences, and there will be some mistakes, but we should figure out what the standards are about what you do before you release it, and we should absolutely hold people to account to see, did they proper follow software engineering? Can they demonstrate the logs and the accounting of the software, that was really something they couldn't have handled in the lab and caught beforehand. I think it's like any other product, and we will just establish this. And that's, while we're thinking that it's people, then we think it's something different. But it's not people, it's a product, and absolutely we can do the same kinds of standards we had before.
Andrew, does Silicon Valley sort of eschew the whole mantra of move fast and break things when it comes to autonomous cars, to AI in general? Because it's important to get this right, as you've been saying.
Yeah, I think it depends to some extent how high the stakes are. I mean, safety critical AI, autonomous cars, that's an unfamiliar space, largely. You know, if you're recommending movies and you get the recommendation wrong, well, you probably won't even notice. The consequences are not very bad, so why not get out there? And I think, I mean, it's certainly true in terms of, entrepreneurship that, releasing the new software every 2 years, fully tested and all that, it's very conservative, and it may not be very creative. And so, yes, there's certainly some virtue in that mantra. But I think we've just got to be aware of how high the stakes are when we do these things.
Speaking of movies, and going back to the Killjoy thing, just quickly, we do know that actors and characters are different, and yet we still enjoy movies. So actually, my group is doing research right now about whether people can both find a robot really cute and humanoid, but also understand that it's a machine and turn it off, and whether we can introduce that duality.
Yeah, okay, let's have some more questions. There's one, sorry, can you see, just a bit further back and along, he's got glasses and a grey top on. Keep going, keep going. Yeah, you, yeah. Wave your hand about, yeah. Great. I'm paranoid about sort of guessing what clothes are called. Now, is it a cardigan or a jumper? I don't want to get it wrong.
It's fine. My name's Justina, and I wanted to ask a question around governance and prejudice. I read a report by ProPublica who were talking about in the US, they are using a type of machine or software to see how likely you are to reoffend if you're arrested for a crime. And what they found over a long period of time was that Black and then Latino members of society were more likely to be rated as higher reoffenders, even if in reality they had never offended and a white counterpart actually had like 10 years of history but was rated as a 3. So I know that we said that these are core issues we need to be thinking about, but my question is, this software is being used right now, it's affecting judges' judgment, and it's an immediate issue. So what are some areas around governance that we can start doing today rather than waiting a few years down the line?
Absolutely, great question. And
Rima should.
Sorry.
No, Rima, you're looking at legal issues, aren't you, with some of your citizens' juries? Is that right?
Yeah, I actually just wanted to ask if you could summarise that question, because I didn't quite catch all of it.
So what she was saying was that there is a system, and it's called Compass, and it's made by a company called Northpoint, and some interrogation of this by ProPublica has shown that over time, this software is used to look at reoffending rates of people in prison. And the Ministry of Justice has a system called Oasis, which isn't the same kind of thing, but we do have a system that does achieve the same end. The ProPublica investigation found that over the long term, and I'm not as familiar with this as I should be, but over the long term, it seemed to is it right that it was saying that black offenders and other non-white offenders were more likely to reoffend, and so was suggesting that they, yeah, that they,
Yes.
right,
Yeah.
yeah, yeah. So there was a bias in the judgments that it was handing down, essentially, on how on people's reoffending risk, and this is. This has been challenged in court as well, and one of the problems is that it's a black box, and the companies say it's proprietary, so you cannot.
And people have done much better with academic systems. So we, people have gone out and done, but actually they've shown with Mechanical Turk that most people can do better, right? But also they've built better decision tree software, which is actually, something you can open and see what it's doing that does a better job. So it absolutely is something we could right now say that no, you cannot have unauditable software that makes decisions. And in fact, the EU has already said this. So thank God we're in the EU, and we're covered by this law. So you could challenge that in court right now.
So there's a whole series of issues in relation to this particular scenario that we're really interested in exploring. One is, I think, about the nature of the criminal justice system. Where does the criminal justice system get its legitimacy from? And in most criminal justice systems in the UK and in the US, you do have criminal juries. So I think there's a really interesting question there. Like, what is the role of an AI in determining and shaping the legitimacy of a decision made by a criminal justice system? And that's ethical, because arguably one of the reasons for why we've historically had lay juries for a long period of time is that they are able to deliberate about and lend the decision-making purpose some legitimacy. And simply saying we're going to replace that with an AI mechanism really arguably shifts the very nature of the legitimacy of a criminal justice system. That's one issue. The other issue is the trade-off between efficiency or effectiveness of accuracy and I guess what that system needs to do in order to get there. And so this is the problem with something that might ending up being quite accurate in terms of outcome. Firstly, even if it is accurate, very unlikely that it will always be 100% accurate. There are always miscarriages of justice. There is a decision that we need to make as a society as to whether we're going to hand that over to a criminal justice system that will make a decision on the spot, or are we actually going to say, well, we want to take time and think about this properly and deliberate about that? There's a cost there, but there's also a cost on the other side of the spectrum as well. So it reduces maybe the time that you spend making a decision, but then there are all sorts of ethical issues with the implications of the fact that we're basically deciding about someone's life in these circumstances, in these ways.
In this particular case, it isn't, it's something that's being used to help judges, and it's already being done, so it's being plugged into sort of a bit of the criminal system.
I was just about to get on to
All right,
that.
okay,
So the other point is that there's the future scenario of how far the application use of AI can go. And so that's like one extreme, but obviously there is a really interesting point about the fact that the use and application of AI in criminal justice system can help assist judges, and it can help assist juries to make their decisions. And actually, but then there's a really interesting question, which is what does it do? Is it to provide a recommendation, or is it to actually, in which case there's a power dynamic there, which needs to definitely be unpicked.
But the question
is it to help interpret data? And again, there's a power dynamic there.
But the question is that in the UK right now, this is already being done in a few police departments, right?
Sorry?
So in the UK right now, some police departments are already taking this kind of advice. And if you suspected that the system was as bad as this Californian system, what would you do? So I don't know. I don't do British law. So if you found out that your community's police system was using an AI system, and maybe you don't even know if it's biased or not, and you just wanted to find out whether it was biased, what are the steps you take?
Well, there's a lot of great innovation going on around that. I mean, I guess with Compass, I'm very curious to know, there are two ways you could approach that. You could train the system on previous decisions, in which case if previous decisions had been biased, then you'd bake the bias in.
Yes.
Alternatively, you could train the system on previous outcomes. That is, did the did the person reoffend or did they not? Even then, you may not find that that is socially acceptable, the result is socially acceptable. And because it may still, maybe because the data set was too small or for whatever reason, it may still appear to be using a principle which is unacceptable socially. But what I find fascinating, I'm sorry, I'm unreconstructed techie, is that people are finding ways both to monitor much more effectively what these systems are doing and to kind of bake in principles as well as data, so that you simply cannot use colour, shall we say, as a criterion for making the decision, and even disallowing the kind of indirect use of colour. So it's easy enough just to strike the colour field out of your data if it happens to be there, but if you use, let's say, postcode data, it might turn out that indirectly. So even those kinds of biases can be sort of sniffed out, and something can be done about it, which I think is absolutely great.
Can I just say something that I feel an exasperation about this issue, though, is in that these systems are out there affecting people's lives and their freedoms. It's great to have these academic, it's great academics are working on it, but what we haven't talked about is what is the pressure outside of Europe, because we know there are some things coming through in Europe in a few months' time that may change things a bit.
GDPR.
But what is the pressure in the US, where that system is used on people every day, to, if that system is deemed to be, bad, to get rid of it?
That was what I was
better.
going to try to talk about, because you were talking about cool stuff we could do to make it better. But in fact, there's a bad system. And it's really important to realize that this system looks like it was a badly handcrafted decision tree or something, right? It's like somebody just built a bad system, sold it to California, now California will admit they made a mistake, right? Or some part of California, not the whole state. But anyway, one system like this that has actually gone to court successfully was in Idaho. And in this case, it was about allocating, so there were people that suddenly got less money for their disability, all right? And they said, and Idaho said, we've outsourced that. It's this guy, Fred, I don't remember who it is, Fred's system, okay? And Fred says, that's my IP, you can't look at it. And the ACLU took him to court, won. They went and looked, and it's a mess. It's like, it's AI. It's a giant Excel spreadsheet, with macros and stuff, right? It just made no sense, right? The point is, probably what happened there was that Idaho was running out of money. They didn't want to raise their taxes. They said to this guy, save money and make sure that nobody can tell how it was done, right? That is still AI. You don't have to use the sophisticated machine learning systems, unfortunately, right? So I think it's really essential that we have better answers than we've been able to generate here to your questions. Citizens need to know how they go and complain if they think that there's something going wrong. Now the problem, of course, like government in general, of course there'll be people that believe like the most perfect system in the world is doing something wrong. But there needs to be ways to audit, there needs to be clear ways to go and deal with these problems, because yes, this is a present problem. And as I said, the ACLU was able to, in Idaho, and I believe actually Texas has found something similar, they said that's not due process. Due process involves being able to audit the code. Right, so some states are making that decision, but it hasn't been regularized yet. And as people were saying before, it's an international problem. So I hope this is something we can come to terms with. For example, through the UN's Internet Governance Forum.
I'd really love to get a question from the balcony. If there's anyone, should we take? Yeah, can we take this one here? And yeah, go on. I wonder if we might actually just get you to give you guys give your questions like each one really quick, and then we'll take the three and respond to the most interesting ones. Put your hands up so the guy put your hands up so the guy knows where to put the microphone. Okay, here, one either side of you.
Right. So should I just?
Oh, you don't actually have a mic. Okay, yeah, go ahead.
Right. Okay. I'm a PhD student at the data privacy group at Imperial, and I was wondering. So AI is all very data dependent, right? Any machine learning algorithm you build is going to be super data dependent, and we're seeing research that comes out that says, for example, you can figure out what my gender is from my location, et cetera, et cetera. But on the other hand, there are people like the senior editor of The Economist that argue that we should, stop worrying about privacy and give AI all the data it needs because we can, cure cancer. So yeah, I was wondering if you guys had an input on how we should make these decisions in any of the fields that they happen to pop up.
Could we, before you guys address that, can we just grab the other question that was up on there, super quick? If you can just say a question pretty briefly, both of you just saying pretty briefly, and we'll take them on.
So, what kind of social, political, economic system do you see existing in 50 years' time when AI can do most things?
Okay.
And so I'm Harry Berg, and I wanted to ask a question directly to Malcolm, who I think raised some of the most thought-provoking points, and that's how do you think that the religious community will adopt or be affected by the use of artificial intelligence?
Great, thanks. Can I just ask, I didn't, the first question was a bit quick for me. I didn't catch it. Did you catch the first question?
The first question is on data privacy and whether we should keep the data privacy and how. Okay. Because a lot of people say, well, if you give your data, we will be able to do some amazing thing like cure cancer. And on the other side, we do have these kind of biases, right? So I believe on data privacy that it is something you should actually be responsible for, so it's your own decision. Currently, it's not your decision, unfortunately. This choice is taken away from you. And I believe that this choice must come back to us. So I believe that it is on us, that's on our plate, scientific plate, to find a way that we will protect each and every datum that is ours. And once you can do that and tag your data with your own tag, right, you will be empowered to give the data to whom you think is useful or you want or whatever else reason, right, including money. Currently, we are not able to do that, and I don't think this is okay, no matter what's the cause, right?
So there's a really interesting intersection between the issue of data and consent in particular, consenting to give over your data, and again, this question about AI and its competency, its ability to presumably in future and indeed now gather information, gather data that we might not necessarily consent to giving across. And I think there's a kind of cumulative problem there that we haven't cracked, which is that we seem to think as a society that data ethics is governed around this principle of consent, meaningful consent. So there's a lot of discussion about ethics as being, well, I consent to give my data away, and a lot of debate about the issue of consent as no longer being meaningful. But maybe we need to really, really rethink this principle of consent as being the basis upon which we give our data away, particularly if we never really consent to give our data in a meaningful way, in future. So you can imagine the AI systems in the future that gather huge amounts of information about, imagine that I'm walking down a path every single day. There could be a system that gathers a lot of data about me just by being around me and being able to act and respond in that way. But actually, I've never actually consented to give that information about myself.
But this data is given to your phone.
Sorry?
This is already given to your phone because your location is always on.
The other day I went to I went to a hotel using Maps software, and 7 days later I was asked by the phone to give a review, and I'd never actually said to my phone, I'm really happy that you know that I'm staying at XYZ place, but it knew and it asked me for information, and I think that for me felt, we're seeing that now, and that could potentially become taken to quite extreme lengths in future.
I want you all to address that second question as the final one we do on the night. But before that, Malcolm, there was a specific question about...
I think the last two questions come together for me, rather interestingly, if I may. How will the religious communities respond to AI? Well, faith communities are not separate bubbles, they're everywhere. There will be people with faith, Christians, Muslims, all sorts, doing AI stuff at the cutting edge, I expect. They may not make a big deal of it, but they'll be there. So I expect that we'll deal with this just like pretty much everyone else does, although given that most religious communities in the West have a slightly higher age profile than the population as a whole, will be slightly later adopters. just as the Church of England is using digital in getting its message out, we'll use AI in as far as it works. But what is it about being religious? What does that, what's the distinction? I think it's really quite interesting. This is the second question about 50 years from now. I think one of the reasons why religious communities in general are standing out more as odd and non-mainstream is because most religious traditions have serious problems with the atomized individualization of societies. Being religious means seeing yourself as part of a historical community that's been around for quite a long time, and living, it's not just propositional knowledge, it's how you live as a person with faith. And that, I think, means relationships are privileged, community is a privileged concept, and we see a lot of social trends undermining that, and that's part of the marginalization of religion in the West. Now, the key question about AI is it going to exacerbate that trend, or can it be used to challenge that trend? I think if we see AI driving more and more wedges between people and their interaction and their sense of belonging to one another, there could be, I don't say I predict it, there could be not only a religious pushback, but from all sorts of people who find the erosion of community deeply threatening. If, on the other hand, AI can do things that lead to the healing the sick, strengthening community, making us actually work better together, I can see religious communities embracing it gladly. So I think, again, it takes us back to where we've been for a lot of this evening. The political, economic, historical context is absolutely crucial to how this pans out in reality.
I would like to comment on this one. You said 50 years in future. I don't think this question is possible to answer. Think about it. 25 years ago, we did not have internet. 25 years ago, we did not have mobile phones. Definitely not smartphones. But the internet is really important. How much we connected with each other. How much disruption it introduced. Just 5 years ago, we had the rise again of deep learning. I mean, neural networks were introduced in 1970. But after so many times now, we have processing machines that can actually run them, and hence, things are absolutely unpredictable. I put a project 3 years ago. I have to redefine the project because the methodology is completely changed. So it's really important to understand the speed and the acceleration of the technology is phenomenal. And we have no clue where we will really be. However, it's really important, in my opinion, to talk about these kind of issues and try to regulate certain things. Like, for example, who will be responsible if the driverless car kills somebody, right? These kind of things we have to start thinking about. What we're going to do if we will have no countries, but we will have companies that own us? Is that a good thing? So these are the kind of things that we have to think about. But really, predicting 50 years I don't think it's possible currently.
Okay, I'll do it. So 50 years I like a lot better than 5 or 10 years, to be honest. Because I don't think, as cool as all the stuff we've been talking about is, I don't think it's much bigger of a deal than writing was or than telephones were. Telephones, telegraphs, rail, right? And that is not to say those weren't really big deals, right? But I think there's two fundamental problems. One is sustainability. How do you live in a planet? How do you live in a space? And the other is this inequality issue we've been talking about. How do you distribute things between people? And those are the issues we have to deal with well or badly. I think right now the big issue is there's people who want it to be more unequal so that they have even more power, and they don't realize that makes their position even more fragile as well. And that's what happened in America after the crash, after World War I and the crash of 29, then even the most elite said, okay, we've got to fix this. And then unfortunately in Europe it had been left in such a bad state after World War I that it was only after World War II and they did things like outline the extraction of wealth from countries. In 1945, they sat down and made illegal things that are happening now when people transfer wealth out of countries, which is one of the things that keeps hurting Greece and Afghanistan and Russia, right? So those are the kinds of challenges. And how we handle this in the next few years and whether we damp down the inequality without wars, that's the big question. But I think in 50 years, we'll have gotten used to AI like we're used to writing. And writing used to be seen as magic and witchcraft and action at a distance that was really freaked out too. We'll be used to it in 50 years, and we'll be back to the basic human problems again.
We're going to be kicked out very, very soon. But if, Andrew or Rima, if you want to add anything more on the 50-year vision, please do.
I think that's a splendid point to come to rest on. I think that's. I certainly have great optimism, along with Matt Ridley, a writer that I greatly admire. I have optimism for the kind of ingenuity of humankind, and we have many problems and a society to face. But I think AI and actually the use of data, I think perhaps we haven't emphasised quite enough as a means of making good decisions. I think these are fantastic tools that we'll use to craft very innovative solutions to the problems that we face, for example, sustainability of living on the planet.
I think we just need to understand better this sense of common good. If it exists, what does that look like? And part of our challenge with AI is that we have never really managed to forge that, and we have found it particularly difficult in recent years to forge that. And so AI is developing rapidly, and not only do we now need to forge that sense of common good, or what I guess Michael Sandel called the sites for the cultivation of a common citizenship, we also need to understand and interpret how they apply to the changes that are happening, and that interaction between technology and citizens. So I think sites for the cultivation of common citizenship have to be created, but then more generally, we've got a huge challenge, which is understanding how they apply to the ethics of AI itself. I actually think spaces like this are really crucial. We need much more of this if we are going to realise that vision. We don't have enough of this, but I think it's fantastic that we made a good start.
We absolutely are on the dot going to be kicked out. So, look, huge thank you to you for coming along on a Friday night. Thanks for the panel. Thanks very much. I'm sure they'll grab you.